The bulk of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, is devoted to what he is going to call the other, the subterranean, the interminably heroic production, which also is unfinished. And what is this? Well, quite simply, Pierre Menard has the ambition, he's made the decision to write the Quixote, not to translate it, not to plagiarize it, not to reproduce it, but to write it, and in a way that we're going to talk about in just a few moments. So Borges begins by talking about his inspiration for this. He says, two texts of distinctly unequal value inspired the undertaking. One is a fragment by Novalis, so an important author, number 2005 in the Dresden edition, which outlines the notion of total identification with a given author. Okay, so that's one possibility. Pierre Menard is not actually going to totally identify with Cervantes, though, as we see. The other was one of those parasitic books that set Christ on a boulevard, Hamlet on La Canebière, or Don Quixote on Wall Street. Like every man of taste, Menard abominated these pointless travesties, which Menard would say were good for nothing but occasioning a plebeian delight in anachronism, or captivating us with the elementary notion that all times and places are the same or are different, right? And then Borges has a little bit of digression. It might be more interesting to attempt what Daudet has so famously suggested, conjoin in a single figure both the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote and his squire. But Menard is not going to do that either. Instead, what is his project? He doesn't want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote, the novel that Cervantes had written before. And he says, nor surely need one be obligated to note his goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it. His ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided word for word and line for line with those of Miguel de Cervantes. So that is the goal here. And he says, my purpose is merely astonishing, he wrote me on September 30th. The final term of a theological or metaphysical proof, the world around us, or God, or chance, or universal forms, is no more final, no more uncommon than my revealed novel. The sole difference is that philosophers publish pleasant volumes containing the intermediate stages of their work, while I'm resolved to suppress those stages of my own. And the author says, there is not a single draft to bear witness to that years-long labor. A little bit later, he talks about observing Menard burning up entire notebooks, right? So what is the analogy here? I'm producing something that is remarkable, but I'm getting rid of all the showing my steps. And then there's a question, well, how is this going to be carried out? And Menard rejects the idea of learning Spanish, returning to Catholicism, fighting against the Moor or Turk, forgetting the history of Europe from 1602 to 1918, to be Miguel de Cervantes. And he says, I thought about that, but that would be too easy. And the author then says, too easy? You might actually say too impossible. And then we get a very interesting reflection here, right? He says, the undertaking was impossible from the outset, and of all the impossible ways of bringing it about, this was the least interesting. So we can distinguish between different impossibilities on the basis of how interesting they could possibly be. To be a popular novelist of the 17th century in the 20th seemed to Menard to be a diminution, right? being Cervantes and arriving at the Quixote, that looked less challenging than continuing to be Pierre Menard and coming to the Quixote through the experiences of Pierre Menard, a 20th century author. And he says, if I were immortal, this would be a task that I could, in fact, carry out. And then we're going to get an interesting discussion, and this is coming from an actual letter about, why the Quixote? Why? It makes perfect sense, Borges says, for a Spaniard to do this. It's like a national epic. But why would a French symbolist be writing the Quixote? So Menard, in a letter, says, the Quixote deeply interests me, but it doesn't seem to me inevitable. I cannot imagine the universe without Poe's ejaculation. Bear in mind the garden was enchanted, or the Bateau Ivre, or the Ancient Mariner, but I know myself able to imagine it without the Quixote. So he says the Quixote is a contingent work. Contingent means it's something that could happen or not happen, right? He says, I can premeditate committing it to writing, as it were. I can write it without falling into a tautology. Now, a little bit later in that same letter, he is going to say that composing the Quixote in the early 17th century was a reasonable, necessary, perhaps even inevitable undertaking. Now, that shows that he is saying something and taking it back, which is in character for Menard, given what we know of his visible work. So the Quixote, it's a contingent work, and we might say even the decision is a contingent decision. Then he talks about rules or constraints that he places upon himself. So this is also from that letter. He says that I have assumed the mysterious obligation to reconstruct word for word the novel that for him was spontaneous. This game of solitaire I play is governed by two polar rules. The first allows me to try out formal or psychological variants. The second forces me to sacrifice them to the, quote, original text and to come by irrefutable arguments to those eradications. That's the work that he's doing. Now, isn't that similar to the article that had been mentioned earlier proposing a rule change for chess to make it more interesting and then arguing against that very rule change, rejecting it? So that is what he's doing. And then there's a third constraint inherent to the project. It says, composing the Quixote in the 17th century, that was reasonable. In the 20th, it is virtually impossible. Not for nothing have 300 years elapsed, freighted with the most complex events. Among those events to mention, but one, is the Quixote itself. So these are some pretty strong, not just rules, but constraints or obstacles, as he's going to call it. And then we get an interesting verdict upon the work. So the author says, Menard's fragmentary Quixote is more subtle than Cervantes, than what we would call the original. Cervantes crudely juxtaposes the humble provincial reality of his country against the fantasies of the romance. Menard chooses as his reality the land of Carmen during the century that saw the Battle of Lepanto and the plays of Lope de Vega, right? And Menard avoids strokes of local color. He ignores or banishes that. This disdain posits a new meaning for the historical novel, right? He also is going to talk about a bunch of different interpretations. So when we read of the curious discourse Don Quixote made on the subject of arms and letters, it's a matter of common knowledge that in that chapter, Don Quixote it comes down against letters and in favor of arms. This makes perfect sense for Cervantes. Why? Because he is an old soldier. But is that the case for Pierre Menard? No. that Pierre Menard's Don Quixote, a contemporary of La Trahison des Clercs, the treason of the intellectuals, and Bertrand Russell should repeat those cloudy sophistries. How to explain this? So, Madame Bachelier sees in them an admirable, typical subordination of the author to the psychology of the hero. Others see them as a transcription of the Quixote, the Baroness de Bacour as influenced by Nietzsche. And then Borges says, I'll add a fourth, and it is his resigned or ironic habit of putting forth ideas that were the exact opposite of those he actually held, and he invokes the earlier mentioned attack, criticism, however you want to put it, against Paul Valéry, which was a position that Menard didn't actually hold. The Menard text is also talked about as being infinitely richer, right? So we can compare the same passage arising both in the, let's call it original Quixote of Cervantes, and then in Menard. So we've got this passage, truth whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. So in Cervantes, this is mere rhetorical praise of history, but in Menard, a contemporary of William James, this is a staggering idea, right? The not delving into reality, but the very fount of reality. Historical truth for Menard is not what happened, it is what we believe happened. And the final phrases are brazenly pragmatic because we're reading other things into it, right? Then he talks about the contrast in styles. This is actually not a matter of superiority, perhaps. Cervantes is writing with his own proper style, but Menard is writing in an archaic style, which is somewhat affected. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? From the same passages, because they have different authors, we get different interpretations or evaluations. Finally, we come to this interesting discussion where Borges says there is no intellectual exercise that is not ultimately pointless. And this is a great observation. A philosophical doctrine is at first a plausible description of the universe. The years go by, and it is a mere chapter, if not a paragraph or proper noun in the history of philosophy. In literature, that falling by the wayside, that loss of relevance is even better known. The Quixote, Menard remarked, was first and foremost a pleasant book. It is now an occasion for patriotic toast, grammatical arrogance, obscene deluxe editions. Fame is a form, perhaps the worst form of incomprehension. And Borges calls these nihilistic observations. So Menard is responding to these nihilistic observations that, as he says, are not new. And what does he do? He undertook a task of infinite complexity. He tries to write the Quixote. And he says, I've reflected it's legitimate to see the final Quixote as a kind of palimpsest in which the traces of our friend's previous text must shine through. And he quotes Menard, thinking, meditating, imagining are not anomalous acts. They are the normal respiration of the intelligence to glorify the occasional exercise of that function, to treasure beyond price ancient and foreign thoughts, to recall with incredulous awe with some doctor universalist thought, is to confess our own languor or our own barbarity. Every man should be capable of all ideas, and I believe in the future he shall be. So, some utopian ideas. Then he tells us that Menard's approach, which he's just suggesting here, because obviously it hasn't been carried out, this is a short story, has enriched the slow and rudimentary art of reading by means of a new technique, the technique of deliberate anachronism and fallacious attribution. And this encourages us, for example, to read the Odyssey as if it came after the Aeneid, or to attribute the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ to Louis Ferdinand Céline or James Joyce. Now, if you know either of those authors, they're pretty profane, right? We would get a very different take on this. And by the way, just as a little suggestion here, this is actually something that is carried out in another imaginary world of Borges. Go check out the story Tlan Ukbar Orbis Tertius and see what they do in Tlan with the psychologists attributing different books to different people. So Menard is offering us a different way of carrying out a renovation of those faint spiritual admonitions of understanding the passages. Of course, this is a short story, and Borges is suggesting to us this is something that this imaginary author has at least carried out in part, and maybe this is something that we could apply to other literature as well, but it's just the outlines of this, pun intended, quixotic project of Pierre Menard.